فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So last time we talked about the story of Zakariyya, and we talked about how Zakariyya made this impassionate plea, how he asked God for a son, and then he was given a son. He has a response. He's told that he's going to have a child. He asks how this is going to happen. I'm old, my wife is barren, but this is something that's easy upon God. So part of Zakariyya's divine questioning is that he asked for a sign. And in this episode, we'll talk about the idea of the sign that he asked for and how it represents a larger theme within the chapter of Surat Maryam regarding speech and silence. So starting with verse number 10 in the chapter of Mary, it says, he said, "Give me a sign, Lord." He said, "Your sign is that you will not speak to anyone for 3 full days and nights." He went out of the sanctuary to his people and signaled to them to praise God morning and evening. And here in the Arabic, it says, قَالَ رَبِّ اجْعَلْ لِي آيَةً. So here is Zechariah, he says to his Lord, he says, "Give me a sign." So this is impossible, right? How am I supposed to have a child? My bones are brittle. I have white hair all over. My wife is old just like myself and is barren. So give me a sign that this is actually going to happen. I'm going to have a child. And here in the Arabic, you see the word ayah is used. And ayah literally means a sign. It's also used in the Quran to talk about signs or verses. And the divine voice responds and says, قَالَ آيَتُكَ أَلَّا تُكَلِّمَ النَّاسِ ثَلَاثَ لَيَالٍ سَوِيًّا. So the sign is that he is not going to speak, and that he shouldn't speak to anyone for 3 consecutive nights. And this is interesting and essential because during this time there was this idea of vows of silence. The people were going to not speak, that they were going to create a relationship only with God. And you see that in the next verse where he says, فَخَرَجَ عَلَى قَوْمِهِ مِنَ الْمِحْرَابِ. So Zechariah, he returns and he goes out to his people. فَأَوْحَى إِلَيْهِمْ أَنْ سَبِّحُوا بُكْرَةً وَعَشِيًّا. And it says that signaling to them to glorify God morning and evening. So now Zechariah, he goes out to his people. He lets them know the importance of praising God, not just at night, but also in the morning, and that this is a consistent thing, a habitual act that occurs every single day and not reserved for only specific days of the year. Now, when we look at this verse and we connect it with other verses in the chapter of Maryam, we see that there is this important theme of silence and speech, that we see that Maryam is also told to not speak and speak to others. So as we've discussed several times already, that why does the chapter of Mary, right, Maryam, start with the story of Zakariyya? In many ways, Zakariyya is setting the stage for Mary or Maryam. So when Maryam is told that she's going to have a child, the divine voice speaks and says, فَإِمَّا تَرِيَنَّ مِنَ الْبَشَرِ أَحَدًا فَقُولِي إِنِّي نَذَرْتُ لِلرَّحْمَنِ صَوْمًا فَلَنْ أُكَلِّمَ الْيَوْمَ إِنْسِيًّا. So she's also told that if you see any human being, then tell them that I have made a vow to the most merciful, لِلرَّحْمَنِ of Sawma, that I will be not speaking to anyone. So once again, Zechariah is setting the stage for Maryam, that just like he's given a sign, just like he's given the good news of a child, Maryam is given the good news of a child of Jesus, of Isa, and that she also should not speak to anyone. So one of the things when I was reading this chapter is why, right? Why are they not supposed to speak? And you see that there are different signs in the Quran and the Bible. For instance, you have the famous staff of Moses, Musa, where he hits the Red Sea, where his staff becomes a serpent. So why is it that their sign is that they're not supposed to speak? And if you look more closely at this chapter, you see that there's a larger theme regarding speech and silence. So part of being silent allows you to connect more with God and also emphasizes the power of God, who is able to hear and speak what is right. So if you look throughout the chapter and various verses, you see this theme that's emphasized. So later on, we'll see that when Maryam goes to her people and they are aghast, they are in shock. How is it possible that Maryam, who has been someone who is known to be righteous, someone who is understood to be the pinnacle of faith, how does she have a child out of wedlock? Now, for anyone in that situation, you would want to immediately defend yourself and say, hey, it wasn't me, it was God, right? I didn't even necessarily ask for a child, but God is the one that gave it to me. However, she eventually points to Jesus, Isa, and he actually begins to speak. So her silence in many ways leads to a miracle, the miracle of a speech of a child. And the idea of her silence leads to the idea that God can give speech to whoever he wills. That part of God's divine favor and blessing is that ability to empower someone with words. And we see later in the chapter, we see that this is also emphasized with Ibrahim. So Ibrahim goes to his father and he tells him, "Oh dad, why are you worshiping these idols?" So he says, إِذْ قَالَ لِأَبِيهِ يَا أَبَتِي لِمَا تَعْبُدُ مَا لَا يَسْمَعُ وَلَا يُبْصِرُ وَلَا يُغْنِي عَنْكَ شَيْئًا. So here, Ibrahim, as a young boy, as a young child, he goes to his father and he says, Ya abati. So this is a phrase used in the Quran to talk about endearment. So not just my father, but my dear father. And then he asks him a question and he says, why are you worshiping something that doesn't hear and cannot see and will not benefit you at all? So these two words are important because they also connected to the idea of the divine names of God. So he says, La yasma'u, that these idols, they can't hear. So this is connected to the idea that God is as-sami', that he's the one that hears everything. The part of God's attribute, which makes him distinct from all other creations and beings, is the idea that he can hear not just our thoughts, but everything, whether that's what's in our heart or what we say on our tongues. And the idea of basir, that God is ever watchful. That yes, we can see certain things, but God can see everything and at all times and all places. So Ibrahim goes to his dad and he says that these idols are not worthy of worship. Why? Because they are not samia. They don't have the ability to hear and they don't have the ability to see. And then he says they cannot benefit you at all. That you may pray to them, may worship them, but stones do not have the ability to respond to your prayers, and they don't have the ability to see the trials and tribulations within your life. Now, that is in that verse of Ibrahim is in the middle of the chapter, and then we see the same idea of speech and silence later on. So when we look at the final verse of this chapter, we see that the divine voice speaks and says, وَكَمْ أَهْلَكْنَا قَبْلَهُمْ مِنْ قَرْنٍ هَلْ تُحِسُّ مِنْهُمْ مِنْ أَحَدٍ أَوْ تَسْمَعُ لَهُمْ رِكْسًا. So it says, imagine how many people we have destroyed before them. Do they still see any of them? Or even heard from them a slightest sound? So once again, we see the idea of sound and feeling and perception, that many people have been destroyed. And once again, this chapter and these verses are understood to come from the late Meccan era, where the Prophet Muhammad was calling his people, and many of them were disobeying. And then the Quran reminds them of the different people, the people of Pharaoh, the people of Thamud, of Ad, people who were destroyed because of their rebelliousness and stubbornness. So the final verse of this chapter says, how many people have been destroyed? How many towns? And do you have any sense from them, from any one of them? Or do you hear any murmur for them? أو تسمع لهم ركزا. And once the idea of sema is used, that part of of being alive and being a creation is the idea of being able to hear, being able to speak. And those people before the Prophet Muhammad in also biblical times were destroyed. And because they were destroyed, you pass by their towns and their villages and you do not hear any life at all. So here the Quran is making a point that part of the divine message, part of the idea of Tawheed, of monotheism, is affirming the attributes of God. And part of the attributes of God is the ability to speak, that on the day of judgment, God will speak and everyone will be silent, and that God is ever hearing, that he hears even the slightest prayer of Zakariyya when he calls out, nada, right? And he calls out nida and khafiyya in a secret manner, that he's calling out, but he is hidden. He doesn't want everyone to know. And we see later with Maryam that she calls out in a state of pain and anguish, and then God responds. So part of the theme of this chapter is to emphasize this idea of Sami' and Basir, that God is hearing, that God hears the prayers, and he's ever watchful, and that he has the ability to hear even the slightest thought, inclination. And there's this idea as well that God has the power of speech. So God controls silence and speech. And when they ask for a sign, and when the birth of the child occurs, they're told to be silent, to connect to God, but at the same time, give the ability to God to speak. So in conclusion, we see here this play within the entire chapter of Maryam of silence and speech. Zechariah starts out the chapter and starts with speech, and the speech is of him speaking to God. But after he speaks, he's told to be silent. He said, now you want a sign. That sign is that you have to not speak, and that God will speak for you. We see this later with Maryam. When she's introduced, an angel comes to her and she speaks. How can I have a child when no man has touched me? The angel responds and says, this is something that's going to occur. And then when she goes out, she speaks and she says, oh God, I am in a state of pain and anguish. What is going to happen to me? And after she has the child, she's told to be silent. And this will eventually lead to the speech of Jesus, of Isa. And we see later that the different prophets, whether that be Musa or Ibrahim, that they go to their people, they go to their relatives, and they call them to the idea of monotheism, of Tawheed. And part of their argument is that God has the ability to speak. He has the ability to hear. He has the ability to watch over all of us. And this is an essential lesson that runs all the way to the end of the chapter, where the end of the chapter ends with the idea that, yes, there are people that lived before us. There are people who had thriving civilizations and towns, but we no longer hear their speech. And we have to reflect upon that and ask, whose speech is heard and whose speech will God empower? Thanks once again for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. Subscribe to this podcast. Encourage your friends, students, and colleagues to subscribe as well. I've got several of your texts. I appreciate your thoughts, your reflections, your ideas on where to take this podcast. Also, feel free to review this podcast. I'm really happy to see reviews on Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify. I appreciate your help and support. And once again, visit my website and my newsletter to see my latest blogs and research, as well as be updated on my future publications. Thanks once again, and take care.